Well, I can honestly tell you, Clay and I are impressed that so many of you decided to come up on a beautiful day like this. I kind of expected this crowd to be on their motorcycles, running around town. It's a beautiful day for it. My name is Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State College, and I want to welcome all of you to our campus and to what is actually the sixth and last session of our fifth year of doing this, Clay.
5 years.
Thank you. I'd like to take credit for this idea, but it's not mine. It was all Clay's. So, by the way, Mr. Jenkinson, I want to say I admire your tie today.
Just trying to keep up, Larry.
Yeah, that's about the classiest tie I've ever seen you wear. That's pretty nice.
I wore it for you.
Thank you.
Because the art of conversation requires harmony.
Okay, we are
I thought
harmonious.
if I would harmonize with your style, maybe that would work.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this topic, well, first, no, I guess I have Robin has asked me to go over the information that you have on your table, so I will do that very, very quickly. To begin with, you got a little sticker here. BSC, this is an announcement for all of you, now has a radio station. It's an internet radio station, and it is BSC Mix MYX, bscmyx.com. And you can go on, and they've got talk, and they've got music, and they've got all kinds of things going on, and it's really it's a great enterprise. We just started it here within the last month, I think. So check us out on your computer sometime. It's an internet radio station, and take a listen to us. And Dusty Anderson, who's in charge of so much of the technology that we do here all the time, and I don't know where he's hiding at right now, is the advisor to the students that are working on this. So we're delighted that he is doing that for us. There's also a critique. Please fill out the critique. Let us know what you want to improve about the length of the programs and all that sort of stuff, and drop them off. Robin will be collecting them at the end of the program because we really do value your feedback. We do a lot of enrichment classes, and the new catalog is just out, so you got a copy of that as well. Everything from dance classes to aerobics to cooking classes and everything else in between. So please take a look at that. And then, of course, we're partnered with UND and with Ollie, and so you've got an Ollie catalog that shows you both what's going on at UND and what's going on here at BSC. And I think that sort of ran the gamut. I value all of you that are here today, but we've got Century High students here today. And we welcome them. I knew this had to be a class assignment because on a beautiful day like today, would they really want to come up and listen to a couple jokers talking here? And then I find out they're actually going to do a critique of Mr. Jenkinson today. So it could be. And so welcome. We're delighted that you came and joined us. Any other announcements? I don't know where Robin's at.
We haven't yet.
Any other announcements?
Remember, we've
done nothing.
Announce that the dates for next year's conversation series will soon be published on our website, BSC Talk, and we haven't chosen the topics yet, so you and I need to do that.
Yeah, and if you have any ideas on this form today of topics that you would like to see us cover, please put them down, and we'll take a look at them and come up with 5 or 6 topics for next year. Of course, one of the topics next year, we're doing a symposium as well. I don't know that you got these out. You've had them before, and there's some out front, I know, as well. November 5th through 7th, 2013, we're going to be doing a symposium on JFK, and we're very excited about that. Clint Hill, and all of you will remember Clint Hill's the Secret Service agent that climbs on the back of the presidential limousine and pushes Mrs. Kennedy back into the back seat. He is now 82 years old. He's originally from Washburn. He is coming, and he's going to be giving our keynote speech to kick off the symposium. We have astronaut Jack Schmitt, who was on Apollo 17, the last crew to blast off from the moon. And for those of us that remember this like it was yesterday, that's 40 years ago. 40 years ago, the last American stood on the moon. That is an amazing thing to think about. But Jack Schmidt, Harrison Schmidt, who went on then to become senator from the state of New Mexico, and he is going to be here to talk about John F. Kennedy and the space program. So, and we've got quite a lineup. Go ahead.
You know him, right?
I do.
And how long was he a senator from New Mexico?
I think just one term.
I just saw this the other day. I was doing some work on this project, and the guy, I don't remember the guy who displaced him, but his campaign slogan was, "Yeah, but what has he done on Earth?"
Oh.
And it worked. I think that's pretty clever, if not very nice.
Yeah, not very nice. I think it's pretty rude.
But clever.
Yeah. I would have countered with, when was the last time you went to the moon? Something like that. No. So, anyway, so this particular conversation, we thought it would be appropriate because we've been calling this BSC Conversations because we've tried to have some kind of conversation which turns into a monologue once in a while, but we try to have these conversations between the two of us. And folks have been showing up now for 5 years, and these have been taped, and they're on cable access here in the Bismarck-Mandan area, Channel 12. And now they're also being shown in Fargo and Grand Forks and Dickinson and
Guantanamo.
And Guantanamo, probably. Cruel and unusual punishment for terrorists.
Well, Larry, if you think these are monologues, why don't you just take it today?
Oh, no.
No, please.
No,
No,
that's
no,
quite,
please.
no, I'm quite all right.
Yeah.
So, but we thought that would be really interesting to have a conversation about conversation. And what is a conversation? And I think Clay and I are both of the mind that conversation in our society today is in jeopardy. The art of conversation, would you not agree? And so we're going to talk a little bit about conversation and talk about some of the great conversations in history that have occurred. And
If Dusty can hear us, I think bring the volume down just a little.
okay, if Dusty can hear us, I know he can hear
it's
us.
just booming slightly.
Okay.
So
Let's go
before
ahead.
we start, I wanted to just do a couple quick things. First,
Yep.
to partly in anticipation of our John F. Kennedy Symposium in November 5th, 6th, and 7th, but just to pause for a moment to think about the achievement of Governor Guy, who did more than any other single individual to bring us to the world that we now take for granted of interstate highways and the big boom in public education. And he re-sparked the State Bank of North Dakota, and he developed the in-state value-added processing of sugar beets and coal-fired generation plants, and he reformed state government and brought our first Office of Management and Budget to the state, and so much else. I mean, he was a giant. He also created the Rough Rider Award. He invented it. He wanted North Dakota to take pride in itself, and so he wanted us to have a Hall of Fame. If you go into the lower lobby of the Capitol, you see those extraordinary names, and he named the first 11 Rough Rider Award winners, beginning with Lawrence Welk, but also including Eric Severide and Dr. Ann Carlson and Dorothy Stickney, Roger Maris, a man of extraordinary achievement, and he died a few days ago and had a funeral last week in Fargo and then another one on Thursday in Bismarck. And so I thought we should just pause for a moment to appreciate Governor Guy. This is my favorite photograph of him. It was I think his favorite photograph. He had it in his study in Fargo. And this was at UND on September 25th, 1963. And what's so interesting about it, Larry, is that when the Kennedy administration decided to send the president to UND to get an honorary degree and to give a speech, they told Governor Guy, oh, put it in a small venue of some sort because you're a prairie state, not that many people are going to come out, and it's better to be full than to have a lot of empty seats. And Governor Guy said, I don't think you understand the character of the people of North Dakota. They're going to want to see the president. And it turned out to be a gigantic event. They had more than 10,000 people in the auditorium, and then outside there were thousands of people standing in reverence because the President of the United States had visited North Dakota. And here they are walking. You can see they're in perfect lockstep. Their legs are, I think it's just so extraordinary. They're both new frontiersmen. They were 2 years apart in birth. And so when John Kennedy said in his famous inaugural address, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war. You know, both of them were Navy men. Both of them had their ships sunk by Japanese warriors. And so there was a strong connection between the two of them, and it really helped to shape the history of North Dakota.
And I might add, Clay, and this is not a setup in any way, but I was at the Bismarck funeral memorial, I guess more appropriately, at the Presbyterian Church here the other day. And Clay, I thought you did a magnificent job of your tribute to the governor. It was
I was
really,
so honored to be asked to give a talk, and I followed Senator Conrad and Senator Dorgan. That's pretty upsetting company to have to follow.
Yeah.
I just wanted to announce for everybody that our documentary, the Dakota Institute, David Borlaug is here today, but the Dakota Institute has done 2 documentary films before, one on Art Link and one on Bill Guy, and now we have one coming out in just a few weeks on Harold Schaefer and Shyla Schaefer and Ed Schaefer and Gold Seal and Medora. It's called Mr. Bubble, the Harold Schaefer story, and it premieres at the Roundup out in Medora on June 8th, but it'll also have a premiere here in Bismarck, yet to be announced, and another one in Fargo, and it will be shown on Prairie Public Television in June or July. So that's just being finished now.
What a remarkable individual he was, and what a remarkable family, huh?
Oh, amazing. And, you know, the story we tell in the film is that Harold Schaefer, having moved literally from rags to riches. He was born in great poverty up near Stanton, and he accidentally, at the age of 7, they lived in a little, very modest little farm, and at the age of 7, he took the ashes out, the coal ashes out, to put in the ash pile, and it was a blizzard, and the ashes blew back, and caught fire to the manure that had been pressed up against the house as insulation, and burned the house down. And so they start with poverty, and then they really know poverty. And there was a piano in the house, which was the family's prized possession, and the house is literally burning down. And Harold, at 7, and his father pushed that piano through the wall out onto the prairie, and the piano is now in the Schaefer Center out in Medora. It's an amazing story. And so then he went to Medora when he became a very wealthy man. He gave us Mr. Bubble, Snowy Bleach, Glass Wax, Fire Wax, etc. And then in the early 1960s, he fell in love with the Badlands. He had loved them all his life, but now he wanted to do something, and he decided to rebuild Medora. So all these stories are told in this film. It's a great story, and this hat, you see the yellow hat? So Jim Fugly, Shyla has one too, and they both had these matching yellow leather, highly authentic Western costumes worn by cowboys everywhere. And so Jim Fugly and I were out at Shyla's cabin, her house in Medora, looking for some stuff, and we found the hats, the yellow hats. So we wore them for a day, and we narrowly got out of town without incident. And then I just wanted to say one more thing before we get into conversation, and that is I was in the Outer Banks in North Carolina giving a talk about 2 weeks ago, and my host was an extraordinary man who's the founder of the St. Patrick's Academy in Norfolk, and he was driving me to this history center, the Outer Banks History Center. We were talking about Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh was an Elizabethan courtier. He named Virginia, the state of Virginia, after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. He was responsible for the lost colony of Roanoke, which is in the Outer Banks. He was an extraordinary legal figure and wit, and he's the one who famously threw his cloak down for Queen Elizabeth so she wouldn't have to step in the mud. Became one of the iconic moments of the Renaissance. Anyway, her successor, James I, came to power in England in 1603, and he didn't like Raleigh, and he believed that Raleigh was caught up in some treasonous activities, and so he put Raleigh in the Tower of London, which is the London prison. And Raleigh lived there from 1603 to 1616. And during that time, he wrote this book, which is called The History of the World. And it's a history of the world. It's one of the greatest books of the Renaissance. And he wrote it in prison. They allowed him to have a small library of 500 volumes, which at the time would have been immense. And he wrote this folio. This book is 20 inches high and 14 wide. And it's one of the supreme works of historiography. No one reads it anymore, but they had a copy of it at this museum, and I got to play with it for a couple of hours. And
First edition copy.
it's a 1614 first edition of the history of the world with these extraordinary plates and so on. So I just thought you'd be interested in that as a historian.
They made you wear gloves.
I wore gloves. But the woman who was the curator, who was very uptight about this, she went into this whole thing about gloves. And of course, actually the standard now of rare books is that we don't wear gloves anymore because they make it harder for your fingers to do their work. They actually cause more trouble than they prevent. And so she's going on and on about the importance of wearing gloves, and she tore a page with her gloves, and I said nothing. And then finally, I was in Fargo, and out at Bonanzaville, they have the actual cornerstone, shown here, of the library, Fargo College, that Theodore Roosevelt dedicated in 1910 after he left the presidency, after he came back from his year-long safari in Africa. And he dedicated it on September 5th, 1910. The college is gone. It's where Offutt Implement Dealership is now. But the cornerstone was preserved, and it's out at Bonanzaville. And it was on that occasion that Roosevelt said, "I would never have been the president of this country had it not been for my time in North Dakota." So that's one of the most important sentences ever uttered in North Dakota. And it was on this day at this place, and this cornerstone has been preserved, and now a neighborhood association is trying to get it returned to the actual site and some sort of a memorial there. So I thought you'd find that interesting. So that's it. Go ahead.
No.
You're on your own now.
No. Let's go.
So I just wanted to show some images to start with of conversation. So I've got a few here. Just look at these. These are just so beautiful. Just paintings from the last 500 or 600 years about conversation. This is a salon. So conversation really had a flourish during the salon era in French culture and European culture, also in the United States. And the salon sometimes was at the houses of aristocrats. Jefferson attended a number of them during his 5 years in France, but there was also an annual salon where new paintings were displayed. And they weren't displayed as they are in our museums. They were just, all the walls were just absolutely covered with them, as you see here. And then there would be parties to critique the new paintings, but also just to create the art of conversation about the importance of arts in French culture. I just love that painting. And then another more recent and more intimate view of conversation, a Victorian or Edwardian image. Isn't that sweet? I'm trying just to give everyone a sense, and maybe you can all just be thinking as we look at a few more of these, of what conversation really means to you. And one of the things that I put to you a couple of weeks ago when we started working on this, Larry, is what makes for a great conversation? What are the best conversations you have had in your life? What makes them, all of us have conversations every day. Did you take the dog out? Yes, I did it an hour ago. Well, it's at the door. Well, you take it out. No, I'm doing the dishes. Hey, I'll do the dishes if you'll take the dog out. We have those conversations all day, every day in our lives, at work, with family, with acquaintances on the street. Hey, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? See you. We should get together. Those don't really qualify in the full sense of conversation, but nevertheless, they are conversations. But what makes for great conversation? What are the qualities or the topics or the atmosphere. What are the ingredients of a great conversation? I'm going to ask you to reflect on this so that there's no monologue, so just wait a minute here. Here's a conversation of politicians over coffee. I think that's a beautiful painting. This is lovely, too. That's sweet. Mm-hmm. This is sort of mock enlightenment. And then finally this one. So Larry, reflect on conversation.
Yeah. Well, you and I were talking about this, and I think, obviously there's kind of a hierarchy of conversations, isn't there? Taking the dog out is probably at the lowest level of conversation. And then at some point you get to where conversation becomes educational, intellectual, maybe enjoyable at whatever level. But, if you take Maslow's theory of needs, the hierarchy of needs, and you could probably do the same thing with conversation. There's just the basic informational conversation that you have. There's, I went on the internet and I Googled this thing. I thought, well, how many different kinds of conversations are recognized out there? It is amazing the number of sites that say there are 5 kinds of conversations. Then right next to it, there are 7 kinds of conversation, and there are 9 types of conversation. So there's all, everybody that's got a theory about conversation divides them up into different categories. But I think when you and I were talking about, well, what are the most enjoyable conversations? The most enjoyable conversations, I think, are the conversations that really don't have an agenda other than to converse. So if your conversation, if you're trying to convince somebody to let the dog out, that's a very different kind of conversation. If you're involved in a conversation that's probably a decisional conversation, in my job as an administrator, when I talk to people, I have many, many conversations, and you try to get information and you're trying to make decisions. Those aren't always enjoyable conversations. They're necessary conversations, but not necessarily enjoyable. So what you and I were talking about as we were getting ready for this is that somehow the higher that you can elevate a conversation into the realm of enjoyment, and just to have an educational, enjoying conversation is probably the best conversations. When you leave a conversation where I have learned as much from you as you've learned from me, and we've enjoyed the exchange. Now, there may be some residual decisions that are made out of that or something, but the whole purpose of the conversation ought to be enjoyment, I think.
Well, I was thinking about this too after our conversation about it, and I spend a lot of time in airports and coffee shops, and it's amazing how many conversations you sort of slightly overhear but really don't. But you hear little bits of them. And it's so common for people to have conversations about conversations they've had. And I hear someone saying, so he said to me, blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, and it's one person recounting a conversation to another, and it's almost always recounted in such a way that makes the person telling the story the hero and the other person the cad. Yeah. And sometimes when people say to me, like, and so I said to her in no uncertain terms that she could take that job, and then I always say, is that what you really said? And they say, no, I didn't say that. But when we recount these conversations, we frequently hype them and dramatize them, and of course make ourselves the hero of them. You never hear a person saying, and I said this to him, and the minute I said it, I realized what a fool I was being. It's almost always the other way around. But I mean, in all the things that I've read about this over the years and in the last few weeks to get ready, the number one quality is kind of a paradoxical quality. It's the capacity to listen generously. And so if you start talking about something that's of interest to you, let's say new faculty that you've hired for next year, if I'm just waiting for you to stop so I can turn the conversation somewhere else, and I'm not really listening at all, I'm putting in the motions of listening, but I'm not engaged as a listener, I'm not listening generously, that's the number one breakdown of true conversation. How often do you go to a dinner party, or you're at a bar or at a restaurant, and you see that one person is speaking and everyone else is just waiting for the moment when that person stops so they can start talking. And then no one's listening. It's really just, how can I get in to this conversation? So there are two things I want to emphasize as we start. Number one is engaged and generous listening. And if you go to a counselor, like a marriage counselor, they'll say, one partner will say, well, he never tells me that he loves me anymore, and I don't understand that. And then the counselor will say, Larry, what did Judy just say? And you'll say, I don't know. They require you to learn the art of careful listening. And almost all conflict resolution requires that. And you were telling me that when you have tense meetings with staff or faculty members, they almost invariably finish by saying, thanks for listening. That's what I really needed. Thanks for listening, right?
Absolutely. People, in the final analysis, I think, when somebody has a conversation, they do want to be heard. And not just the words being heard, but the message being heard. I think that's so important. As we talk about this, so often when you meet people that have met great people, they will say, I met him or I met her, and we were standing in a receiving line, and we had this quick conversation, and I felt like I was the only person in the room. Isn't that amazing? How many times have you heard that? It's an amazing thing. I think you told me that about Bill Clinton.
Well, I think everyone says that about Bill Clinton, but they say that about George W. Bush, that these people master this illusion that they're actually listening to you.
Let's hope that's not what it is.
Well,
Maybe they are listening.
But you often see, if you meet a governor or a senator or a famous musician or whatever, and there's kind of a receiving line, you often see them sort of looking over your shoulder to see who more interesting is coming, or trying to recognize names. And they have to focus to a certain degree, but the thing to remember is that they're not particularly interested in us. Why would they be? Mm-hmm. They have to give the illusion that they're listening. But if you go up to the legislature on any given day, and I mean no disrespect, but they're so overstimulated, and someone's always saying, I don't know if have you looked at this bill, or have you thought about this? And I think at a certain point they just have to start not letting it in, because it would just be overwhelming. And so generous listening is number one. Number two thing of great conversation is a form of playfulness. There's wit, there's humor, there's sarcasm, there's repartee, there is, even if it's about a very serious topic, there is a level of verbal play which makes it more interesting than the topic that you're talking about. So those are the two things that I would say are the key to great conversations. But we often have, sometimes we have conversations that are really hard. You have a conflict with your brother or your mother or your child, and these aren't fun. There's no playfulness here. You're talking about really serious, hard things that you'd actually rather not be talking about. And those can be some of the most important conversations that we have, but they're not exactly pleasurable, are they?
Right. But now, one of the things we're going to talk about today, and I know we're going to get to it, is great conversations. But those kinds of things are important conversations, but are they great conversations?
No, they're important.
They're important.
So let's go on. So first, I just want to recommend, I don't know how many of you have seen this film, My Dinner with Andre. It's a great film. You should rent it. It was made in 1981 by Louis Malle, and it's about two men, here they are, who go to dinner at a restaurant. And it's sort of like, a certain way, it's like the Seinfeld program. It's not really about anything. It's about the pleasure of spending an evening with someone you care about and having conversation that moves in all sorts of directions and sometimes gets a little serious and other times is just playful. But it's a wonderful film, and you can get it on DVD or Netflix or whatever your source is. But it's called My Dinner with Andre, and it's one of the great things ever done about the art of conversation. But it's also just a great film. So now let's talk about, just briefly, about the death of conversation. And I mean no political disrespect of any sort, but here's where we are. You know, just look at these. These are the icons of American talk television. Look at each one of them is not listening. Mm-hmm. This is where we are as a culture that, and here, by the way, is where it started. Remember the old Saturday Night Live? Jane, you ignorant.
Yeah.
That was a parody of The Art of Conversation in the 1980s. It's gotten infinitely worse since. And then so the one thing is that, where are the models of conversation? You know, if you thought in your lives, where are the models of good conversation? If you turn on talk television, you're not going to get it. Now, if you look at Charlie Rose on public television, that's often very fine conversation. He's mostly a setup guy for the guest, but he understands how conversation works. But these guys, you know, they have high ratings, and I mean them no disrespect, but they spend a lot of time doing this, you know, holding forth, interrupting their guests, shouting, making wild, oversimplistic points about this and that. That's sort of, so if that's being modeled constantly, I don't know how you feel, but I think that genre, which is now so pervasive in our culture, has actually damaged our public discourse as a nation. Do you agree with that? I mean, I think it's, however entertaining it might be, it's actually damaged our capacity as a people to engage in participatory democracy, because if you go to the Senex store, you're going to hear the talking points that were heard on radio or on television, and people now feel empowered to be rude and abrupt and righteous and dismissive and sneery in a way that I think is unprecedented in the history of American culture. And it's not solely owing to this, but a lot of it, I think, comes from the way that conversations are now being modeled.
Well, speaking of modeling, I think what they model is not a conversation with somebody, it's talking at somebody. There's a big difference. We can sit and talk with each other, and therefore I respect what you're going to say, you respect what I'm going to say, we have an exchange. Doesn't mean we have to agree. We can disagree completely. In fact, we're going to talk about Jefferson and Hamilton, I think, here in a little bit. But so we can disagree, but we're not talking at each other. As soon as we start talking at rather than with.
Or shouting each other down.
Shouting, and that's what.
Or interrupting.
That's
browbeating. That's what this is about. But that's one area, I think. Here's another one.
Technology's done a lot.
No criticism meant of the students from Century, because it's everybody in this culture. But
yeah, we do that. We're not students from. What do you mean?
You do
me,
that. And look at this.
That's like us having dinner together, Clay.
Well, there are some differences.
One obvious one. But let's not. I don't think we can just blame this on today's technology. Although we're more connected, and there's so much more technology that we deal with. We are connected 24/7. But I think about the pictures of the families in the 50s when television became so common. All of a sudden, families became passive communicators, in that you would line up mom, dad, 3 kids on a couch, sitting here watching Bonanza on Sunday night, and the whole family quit talking to each other, and we're watching that TV. I think one of the best things that my parents did is during meal times, TV was off. We had to have a conversation, which often ended with running and getting an encyclopedia to prove your point. But I think...
How old were you at this time?
Oh, I don't know.
I'm trying to envision little Larry with his little bangs running to get encyclopedia. You actually are saying, you're idealizing your childhood and saying that in your household you had these salons over your meatloaf.
Over meatloaf and yeah. Or
really?
Klub.
Really?
It's a Norwegian.
Yeah, I know what Klub is.
So at any rate, the only reason I bring that up is because I hate to say that we would say that technology today is destroying our conversation. I think that as soon as we got technology into our homes as a pervasive member of our family, that we started ruining our conversation. No?
No, I mean, I take your point, but
Okay.
but the new technologies, I mean,
Far more
I see this all the time, where you go into a restaurant and a person gets a call and takes it, and then speaks at a very high volume to someone that you don't care anything about, and kind of wrecks your dinner. This happens all the time, and there's no sense of etiquette that, you know, you don't take calls in films or restaurants. People text each other. I mean, my daughter will do this. She'll text someone that's 3 feet away, and it's not like saying, "Can you believe how boring Larry and Clay are being?" They're just texting. I mean, they've gotten into the habit of communicating via text, even when it would be easy enough not to. And so I think the technologies, you know, when I was growing up, we had one telephone in our house and one television. And so everyone negotiated about what we were going to watch on television. But there was nobody freelancing on television at all, because that was always a negotiation. There was one telephone. And if I wanted to have a private conversation with somebody, it could not occur because there were people lurking. And that had a very inhibiting effect on my life, as it should. That's why you had the one telephone. If you know, my mother and father would say, well, if it can't be said in front of us, probably
It shouldn't be said.
yeah. So then at a certain point, we got a second television, and then my father would watch one thing, and my mother would go in another room and watch something else. Well, today, in most households, everybody has a television, and that's even a kind of silly thing to say, because we're beyond television now. We're into the era of laptops and tablets and iPhones and so on. Everyone has a phone. So now, if my daughter, who no longer lives at home, but if she wanted to have a private conversation, it's the easiest thing in the world for her to get out of that social milieu. This is both good and bad. It's liberated us to a certain degree, but it also has enabled a lot of uninhibited activity, and the family structure breaks down to a certain degree when that happens. I don't want to sound like a cultural conservative about this, but I worry a little bit about, I just remember wanting to use that phone and knowing that it really wasn't worth it. Because my family was then going to interrogate me about the nature of that conversation.
Well, and then there were party lines.
Where you grew up, there were party lines.
So if you were going to call, just assuming somebody was going to call a girlfriend, there could be 3 other parties listening in.
And then telling your parents.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. You want to?
Should that ever happen?
Is there anything you want to divulge?
Well, you know, one other thing, so we're not so negative about this. The other day I was talking to a young woman who, I said, well, you got big plans for the weekend? And she said, I'm going to Minot. My cousin has been deployed to Afghanistan, and he's coming home this weekend. And I said, well, that's marvelous. I said, have you had any contact with him while he's been deployed? And she said, we Skype every day. I mean, every day this young man has been deployed, he has had face-to-face contact with relatives back home. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, if you went overseas, I was overseas for 2.5 years, I had 1 telephone call home.
Really?
1. Now, you could have had more, but they were so expensive, you know. And so, there is something to say about how this technology has allowed that connection, because we're still sending young men and women all over the world, and in business world as well. You can, you know, I know people that their son or daughter is living in London on a business, working for a bank or whatever, and yet they're Skyping. And now with FaceTime, you can FaceTime. So although it has some negative ramifications that we've already talked about on conversation, as well, it creates a connectivity with families that are separated.
No, absolutely. My daughter lives in New York, and I have FaceTime conversations with her all the time, and they could go from 3 minutes to 3 hours, and they're free. When I was growing up, if my mother called my grandmother in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, my grandmother assumed that someone had died. It was that simple.
Yep.
Long distance call meant something terrible has happened. Otherwise, why would you be wasting this money? And when I went off to study in England, I called my parents once a year. And that that was the best technology of the time that was affordable. And so I get what you're saying, that there's a lot of good that comes of this.
Okay.
But this is not a good picture for a culture.
No.
Okay, so now let's just look at a couple of quotations about conversation. The great charm of conversation consists less in the display of one's wit and intelligence than in the power to draw forth the resources of others. He who leaves you after a long conversation pleased with himself and the part he has taken in the discourse will be your warmest admirer. Isn't that cool? He goes on, this is La Bruyere. Men do not care to admire you, they wish you to be pleased with them. They do not seek for instruction or even amusement from your discourse, but they do wish you to be made acquainted with their talents and powers of conversation. And the true man of genius will delicately make all who come in contact with him feel the exquisite satisfaction of knowing that they have appeared to advantage. Yeah. Isn't that great?
That is.
That pretty much sums up, I think, it's a little cynical, but it sums up the art of conversation.
A great conversationalist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's Truman Capote. A conversation is a dialogue, not a monologue. That's why there are so few good conversations. Due to scarcity, two intelligent talkers seldom meet. So that's a less generous view, I would say, you know. Here's Jane Austen. I mean, her books are filled with great conversations. My idea of good company is the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company. Cicero. Silence is one of the great arts of conversation. Most friendships don't do well with silence. Here's Dr. Johnson, about whom we have more to say in a minute here. Maybe the greatest conversationalist of all time. Here's why we can say that. Dr. Johnson lived in the 18th century, and he wrote the first great dictionary of the English language, 1755, which he did all by himself in 8 years. It's one of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements ever. He also wrote essays called The Rambler, and he has poetry, The Vanity of Human Wishes, and a satire in imitation of the ancient Latin poet Juvenal called London. And so he was like the principal man of letters in the 18th century, just a little ahead of Jefferson. He was more Dr. Franklin's age. Jefferson narrowly missed a chance to meet Dr. Johnson. And Johnson, so he was this extraordinary intellectual, but he also attracted the greatest biographer ever in James Boswell. Boswell had a hero worship of Johnson, met him when Johnson was a middle-aged man, and Boswell had a mimetic capacity to be in a conversation and then go away and write it down. You know, today we would have a recorder of some sort. He couldn't do that. He couldn't even take them down at the time, given the technologies of pens and ink and so on. It would be socially rude also. So he would be at a dinner party that would go on for 4 or 5 hours in London, where there might be 7 or 8 or 10 people, and then he would go away and immediately write down everything he could remember about the conversation. And in the course of his life, he became a genius at this mimetic capacity. And so the life of Johnson, Boswell's immense biography of Dr. Johnson, is regarded as the greatest biography ever written, which I heartily recommend. And it is said by literary historians we know more about the life of Dr. Johnson, thanks to Boswell, than about any other person before the age of electronic recording, because of this thing that he did. So here's Johnson. The happiest conversation, this goes back to what you were saying, is that of which nothing is distinctly remembered, but a general effect of pleasing impression. It's not so much about something, it's about the quality of the conversation. La Rochefoucauld is a French sarcast. The reason why so few people are agreeable in conversation is that each is thinking more about what he intends to say than what others are saying. I find that true all of the time, don't you?
Yeah, not gracious listening here.
Yeah, no generous listening. Here's Robert Charles Wilson. The conversation was mesmerizing, not for its content, but for the cadences of the talk, the rhythm we fell into when we were alone, now as before. Every conversation between friends or lovers creates its own easy or awkward rhythms, hidden talk that runs like a subterranean river under even the most banal exchange.
Well,
that's interesting.
That is
so much is going on beneath the surface of a conversation. Benjamin Franklin, typically generous, the great secret of succeeding in conversation is to admire little, to hear much, always to distrust our own reason, and sometimes that of our friends. Never to pretend to wit, but to make that of others appear as much as possibly we can. To hearken.
very good.
Pretty good, isn't it?
That is.
This is a little more recent. Friendship is an obstetric art. It draws out our richest and deepest resources. It unfolds the wings of our dreams and hidden indeterminate thoughts. It serves as a check on our judgments, tries out our new ideas, keeps up our ardor, and inflames our enthusiasm. So here the friend is almost a midwife to the other person. Just a couple more. Stephen King. He did it as the world's most charming and magnetic people do, always asking the right question at the right time, never fidgeting or taking his eyes from the speaker's face, making the other guy feel like the most knowledgeable, brilliant, and intellectually savvy person on the planet. That's how I always feel about you, Larry.
Yeah.
And Frederick Wiesel, if they're together long enough, every couple has one conversation over and over. Ouch.
Yeah.
When you sometimes go to restaurants and you see a couple that has clearly been together for a long time, and they go through the entire meal without exchanging more than a sentence or two, you ever see that? You think, oh boy, are they done talking?
Over and over.
Over and over. Conversation, what is it? A mystery. It's the art of never seeming bored, of touching everything with interest, of pleasing with trifles, of being fascinating with nothing at all. Finally, Edward R. Murrow. People say conversation is a lost art. How often? I wished it were. And here's Bernard Shaw. The trouble with her is that she lacks the power of conversation, but not the power of speech. Seems a little anti-feminist to me. So anyway, so now that I've given you those texts, reflect a little on what you've seen there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Generous listening.
Generous listening.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. Let's get into the great conversations that we're going to have here.
So
we've done our reflecting, I think, already.
We picked three.
And we've agreed on
these qualities of playfulness,
Yep,
good listening,
Yep.
that it's not so much what it's about as what its feel is.
Right. And a great conversation, there is a hierarchy of conversations. I mean, the quotations that you just had, most of them, are about having that really top-level conversation where one feels like they've learned something, that the others have learned something, they've all been gracious listeners, so there's a hierarchy. You started off talking about, it's your turn to take the dog out. That's not very high up on conversations, but we're going to talk about.
So let me ask you this: you have conversations all the time, of course, and leaving out our conversations, which are these certain. We're not alone somewhere. We're in front of people who could be out doing their lawns. How often do you have great conversations? I mean, just give me a sense of, in the rhythms of your life, how often you come away thinking, boy, that was a good that was great.
Yeah. I think that all of us are sort of bogged down in the day-to-day operations, whatever you do. This is just about me or the college or anything. I think everybody gets sort of bogged down. And so I think, we're really lucky if we can have one or two really good conversations a week. I think that we're fortunate if we can do that. great conversations. You really great conversations. You probably don't have that many of them.
Does that seem right to you, that they're rare? I want you all to go away and think about this, because I think it's so interesting. I've been asking everyone that I've seen for the past couple of weeks, tell me about conversation. And it doesn't go very well at first, because we never think about it. We just do it. Yeah. It's natural. But then they've kind of written me some emails and come back and said, oh, I had this great conversation with my sister when we were washing dishes after Thanksgiving. And there's an incredible monologue by Garrison Keillor from early in his career in a series of programs he did about seasons, the 4 seasons. And it's really some of the best work he ever did. And the one on autumn has a story about Thanksgiving. And so the mother, it's a very funny story, and I won't give all the details, but you should go find it. It's so good. And the mother, the children are coming back from Minneapolis to Lake Wobegon, and the mother decides to create a special new kind of Thanksgiving meal this year, and she completely screws it up. And eventually they wind up eating a kind of turkey hash, and it's just a disaster. And the children are coming from Minneapolis, and they're sophisticated. They've kind of grown away from the values of Lake Wobegon, and they actually stop on the hill overlooking town to explain to their two children who this guy God is, because there's going to be a prayer at the Thanksgiving dinner. And so then they come down into Lake Wobegon, and the meal goes badly. And so, and then the men go off to watch football in the living room on Barca loungers, and the mother and the daughter do the dishes. And Garrison Keillor says, that's when some of the best conversations occur, because you're doing something, you're not looking at each other, you're doing something together. So it gives you a little bit of cover to say things that you might be inhibited in saying face to face. And then he talks about some of the things they said, and so the mother says, I'm worried about your dad. And then a conversation begins. So the daughter says, Mom, do you think I'm pretty? And a conversation begins. And it's very moving about what is made possible by a moment when two people can really let themselves be in it in a way that we usually guard ourselves against. It's a wonderful, wonderful monologue by Garrison Keillor about the art of conversation within families. And as you know, families are very bad about intimate conversations. At least mine is. It's very hard. I mean, my mother and I are very, very close friends. And she's one of my favorite people in the world. But we circle around certain conversations for years, because neither one of us really wants to get in that arena unless you're prepared to go to the mat. And boy, when you go into the mat, it can cause a lot of ruckus. And so we just kind of drift around the edges of it, because it would be so much, we would both be so heartbroken. You know, my mother's motto is, things once said can never be taken back. And so that's what we're both thinking, you know?
Yeah. So in your unscientific survey that you've been doing for the last number of weeks, so what kind of sense are you getting from people? Do people think that it's routine to have a great conversation, or do people say, I've never had a great conversation, or people say, well, you know, there was once 5 years ago I had a great conversation, but I haven't had one since? What's your sense of people's feelings about their level of conversation?
Well, it's all over the map. You know, my daughter, for example, has said that at a certain point in her first semester at university, away from home by several thousand miles, all the young people in her dorm floor would kind of wind up outside in clusters of 6 or outside the room, you know, on the floor of the hall. And she's met, you know, some Islamic people and some Jewish people, including Orthodox Jews, and she has met her first gay and lesbian roommates and people who are radicals and feminists and environmentalists and so on. And she said that some of the conversations that you can have about 2 a.m. are amongst the best conversations that she's ever had, because, you know, it's learning. The learning curve is so great, and you're fascinated about meeting the variety of people. My friend Douglas, who lives in Portland, said the best conversations he's ever had are on long auto trips when two people are driving and they have like 4 days together, and there's no hurry and there's no agenda, and then like on day 2 you're at Monument Valley, and suddenly you're talking about the meaning of life, or the nature of God, or why your relationships have failed, or why you and your brother have never been able to see eye to eye, and that there's something that gets liberated by the journey aspect of conversation. Most people say that women are better at this than men, that women they check their egos at the door for the most part. Men have a harder time with that. Women listen better than men for the most part. Women have a deeper level of immediate empathy than men tend to do. And so the women I've talked to have all said, oh, I have great conversations all the time. My girlfriend and I go to Barnes & Noble, and we go to meet for 15 minutes, and 5 hours later we leave. And we've talked about everything, our children, our work, our troubles, the books we're reading. So, you know, it's all over the map, Larry, but I think people still, here's what I would conclude. I think people are still very hungry for conversation. And I think most people feel that they get too little of it, and that they're too busy, and that just between pets and children and spouses and meals and meetings and church and work, that takes the air out of most of one's discretionary time. And that to get a good conversation a couple of times a month is a really valuable thing. So what do you think?
Well, do you think there's a difference between a good, I mean, this is going to be an obvious answer, I guess, but maybe we could dissect a little bit. Difference between a good conversation and a great conversation. You know,
Yes.
like you might have a couple of good conversations a month. You're out with friends, you're having dinner, or you're washing dishes after Thanksgiving dinner, and you're having good conversations. But then at what point do you have that great conversation that
I think that, I mean, I don't know. I think everyone would probably have a different answer to it. But I think a great conversation is somehow about the meaning of life, you know, about death, about love, about God, about salvation, about what America means to the world, or what we should be as a people. I think that I mean, we have good conversations all the time, but I think a great conversation is one where suddenly something magic happened and everyone relaxed into it, and you're talking about things that you normally would keep pretty close to the chest, and you don't feel embarrassed to be speaking that openly, and the person that you're with is in a trust relationship with your revelation, with whatever you're saying, and then listens well and asks the right follow-up questions and says, no, I think you're being too hard on yourself, that kind of thing. I think that the great conversations are the ones that somehow get deeper into the heart, or deeper into the soul, or deeper into meaning. And, I mean, look, we wouldn't want those conversations too often.
right?
We have to get through life. You can't start that at a meeting for 10 minutes at Starbucks, because that's going to take some time. So I think it requires some kind of magic space, I think, what do you think?
Well, I was just, as you're describing that, I'm thinking that to do that, to get to that level, then there has to be some commonality, it seems to me, between those two conversationalists. There has to be something that, so when they're making allusions about things and they're expressing their feelings about things, that there can be some sort of relationship going on. That doesn't mean that they have to have lived the same life or be physically related. I mean, you could be from different parts of the world, but when you're talking about a particular topic, God, for example, you have to have a kind of a reference that allows you to carry on that conversation.
I think that's right, but I think it's also possible to have a really amazing conversation with somebody where there's a fundamental disagreement, as long as each person is on their best behavior. So I had one with a friend of mine about a year ago, and it was about abortion. And we have quite different views about abortion, both as a physical incident and a moral incident and a legal incident and so on. But there was a trust. It somehow developed that this was going to be a trust conversation, and we could disagree seriously about 3 or 4 different things, and not the way you'd predict. But that somehow there was a magic that made it okay, and there was respect and affection and trust. I think that can happen.
Yeah.
You don't see it too much, because I think you're saying affinity makes it easier.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. But I think that respect that you just mentioned, I mean, if one of you jumped up and
So I could never
can't
trust
talk
you
to
again. You know?
Yeah, yeah, you know, you're wrong.
You couldn't be more wrong.
Couldn't be more wrong. I mean, that's a showstopper right there in a conversation. Rather than, well, I see what you're saying, but I view it differently.
But you know, how about this?
Yeah.
I disagree with that, but you know, I've never really thought about it that way before. Thank you. You've helped me to think about that. How often do you hear that?
On Talk TV, especially.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to have talk about some historic conversations that did occur.
We're going to talk about 3, and
Yep.
we're running out of time because you've been unusually conversational. So here's one, Plato's Symposium. And really a lot stems from Plato's Symposium, written in the 4th century before the Common Era in Athens. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's really worth looking at. It's a conversation about the nature of love. So here's a copy of the book, and you see that in the ancient world at a symposium, we use the word symposium now meaning conference, basically, but symposium really means dinner party in Greek. And so in the ancient world, these would all be men. There might be female entertainers, but these would be men having the conversation, males only. And they would recline. They were on couches. They weren't in chairs. They would recline on a kind of a daybed or a settee, and they would be served. And so here's Plato in Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, pointing up because Aristotle points down to the real world and Plato always points up to the ideal world. Here's another picture of that. And there would often be flute players. The flute players could be men or women. In this case, it's a young man. And they would entertain. There was no recorded music, so all music was live. And there were frequently courtesans. And so what is a courtesan in this context? It's not a prostitute, but there might be sex. But it's not a prostitute. It's more like a geisha. It's a woman who's there to entertain and to create some erotic energy in the air, but it's not a sex party. And so that's how a symposium tended to be, that aristocratic men would come together. They might be naked, as in sort of a locker room situation, but more often they would be wearing a tunic of some sort. Then a flute player would come in and entertain during dinner. There was heavy drinking. And there were courtesans often who were there as hostesses in sort of the geisha tradition. And so that's what a symposium is. In this symposium in Plato, the day before, the tragic poet Agathon won for his play in the theater, and everyone got incredibly drunk, and they're all hungover. And so they're meeting for the second day, and Socrates is coming to this one. Socrates is the great man, the great philosopher. And they all agree that they're not going to drink heavily. They're just going to drink moderately. And they dismiss the flute players, and there are no courtesans. So this is just these men. And they have a conversation, and the proposal is that they have a conversation about the nature of love. And so there are a number of people there: Phaedrus, Pausanias, Eryximachus, Aristophanes, Agathon, Socrates, and in the end, Alcibiades. And each of these extraordinary men gives his theory of love in the course of this. And we won't go into great detail, but this became a kind of a template for the philosophical tradition and for salon culture in the 18th century and for salon culture in the Renaissance. Even Jefferson, in his famous love letter to Maria Cosway, which he wrote in 1786, cast it as a dialogue between his head and his heart. So he's using the same dialogic conversational form. So I won't give full accounts of this, but Phaedrus and Pausanias argue that true love is between two men. Homosexuality or homoeroticism was much more accepted in the Greek world than it became in the Christian world, and the Greeks often felt that heterosexuality is for procreation, but homoeroticism, not necessarily homosexuality, but homoeroticism is for friendship. And so they argue that that's the best kind of love. Well then, Eryximachus is a doctor and he talks about health and so on. Then Aristophanes, that's the one I want to concentrate on for a moment. This is, by the way, Socrates. He was notoriously ungood looking. And that was part of his greatness, is that he was impervious to the usual ways that humans relate to each other. This is a famous painting of the death of Socrates. He was condemned by Athens for corrupting the youth of Athens and forced to commit suicide by drinking hemlock. And this is one of the greatest of all Enlightenment paintings. It's by Jacques-Louis David, a friend of Jefferson's, of the death of Socrates. And there you see this incredible nobilization of the martyrdom of Socrates. Here's the Athens of the time. But here's the one that Aristophanes does. So we finally get through the first few speakers, and then we come to Aristophanes, who's a comic Greek playwright. And he gives us the basis for our term platonic love. You know, we say it's platonic. What he says is, it's a myth, of course, but it's a myth with deep psychological insight. He says that when Zeus, God, originally created humans, he created us with 4 arms and 4 legs. Everyone had 4 arms and 4 legs. And there were 3 types of polyhumans. There were MMs, male, male, and there were FFs, female, female, but most people were MF, male, female. So the great majority of people were half man, half woman, but in one body. A small minority were man, man, and a small minority were female, female. And because humans upset Zeus, he cast a thunderbolt and split us all into 2. That's how we became bipeds with 2 arms and 2 legs. So we were once 4-armed and 4-legged, but because of Zeus's anger, he split the vast majority into male, female, and then minorities into male, male, and female, female, right? So you can guess the rest. We all know this wound, and we go through life trying to find the other half. We go trying to recover the person we got split off from. And so most of us, if you're heterosexual, are looking for the person of the opposite sex, because we got split off from, you and I from women, women from men. But gay people, and there was a very wide tolerance for homosexuality in the ancient world, lesbians, we would now say, are looking for each other, for soulmates, and homosexual gay men are looking for soulmates, and all of us are looking. And then so maybe I fall in love with Judy, thinking she's my other half, but she doesn't turn out to be. And so when you still hear people say, oh, that's my soulmate, I'm married to Biff, but George is my soulmate, you know, because we still all, according to Plato and Freud, we're all looking for that other half that is our idealized self, but in the other person. And so this myth is one of the most important of all of Plato's ideas, that there is a hunger, longing, missing something that we're trying to fulfill, and that it covers not just heterosexuality, but homosexuality too. Interesting.
It is.
Got anything to say about that?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking about that, Pablo Coelho, the
Italian,
alchemist,
right?
No, Brazilian
Brazilian
writer. Yep. And I'm actually reading a book right now in which he talks about this soulmates.
Right.
And, it's sort of a theme that runs all the way through love. And you're suggesting that really began with Plato.
It begins, well, I mean, it begins in human nature, and Plato was the first to create a myth that could really describe it.
Describe it. Okay.
But we still say this today, and I've met so many people who say, well, this guy I knew in college is my soulmate, but Brad is a great provider and a great dad. And I always feel sorry for Brad because, it just seems like this longing is a very deep longing in the human character. So that's Aristophanes. And then finally, after everyone gives their talk, we've been all over the map on these. Finally, Socrates, of course, is asked to give his talk. And he takes it way deeper. And what he says in a nutshell is that love is the most important force in the universe, but that it's not really about bodies. That when you start in love, you're attracted, so I'm a man and I'm a heterosexual, I'm attracted to a woman when I'm 17 years old. And I'm attracted to her in a carnal way, mostly. Maybe it's more than that, but there's a strong element of body obsession and carnality and adolescent sexuality at work. And he says, that's perfectly fine. That's our starter course. And then you grow up and you realize, oh, the kind of people that I'm sexually attracted to are not necessarily good people for me to know. That I think almost everyone comes to a point in their life when they realize, oh, it's more complex than you think here. And the people I'm attracted to are not necessarily good for me and vice versa. And what really is good for me is a little more elusive. So then you go through that phase, and that's the next step. And then the step after that is to create a permanent relationship with somebody, but not to get fixated on that person as a body or to lock that person into a certain time or character set. And then finally, you begin to emancipate yourself from carnality altogether, and you begin to love not a beautiful man or a beautiful woman, but beauty with a capital B, and truth with a capital T, and freedom with a capital F. And at that point, you've arrived into soul maturity, and you have a more tolerant view of all this lower stuff because you realize these were steps that got you there, but it would be a mistake to get stuck at any one of them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So Socrates would say this is a continuous yearning for this.
For the good,
so
the true, the beautiful, the just.
So were the German Romantic writers then lined up with that?
No, because, a romantic like Goethe, Sorrows of Young Werther, they're about nature and woman or friendship or man. They're about this world. But what Socrates is saying is when you finally understand it, it's not really about this world. This world is the world you have to use, and you procreate and you do all the things that people do. But you're really, the real business of life is to understand ultimate forms and truths. And when you do that, everything becomes clear, and you realize how many terrible mistakes you made along the way by fixating on the creature rather than the creator. And this is very important because it's not just Plato. Christianity in the 4th century was in a Platonist mood, and St. Augustine, the greatest of all the Catholic fathers, was a extraordinary Platonist, and he said the mistake we make is loving the creature when we should love the creator through the creature. And he said that's what leads to rape and violence and war and misunderstanding and unhappiness, is because we are fixating on the creature and treating them as objects, whereas if we could see through the creature to the creator, we would treat everything with respect because it's part of God's creation. And so that's a very fundamental Neoplatonist ideal that found its way into Christianity in the 4th century and has been extremely important. And Augustine said, almost his most famous pronouncement in Latin is, Cor nostrum inquietum est donec requiescat in te. Cor nostrum inquietum est donec requiescat in te, and it translates, the heart is restless and unquiet until it finds repose in you, God. Think of that. The heart is a restless thing, searching for love and money and material happiness and power until we learn to see that our rest is in God. And the minute you actually get that, all these other things that have bedeviled you through life begin to calm down.
And Socrates would agree with that.
Socrates would agree with that.
Okay.
In Greek.
Yeah. Not Latin.
Not Latin.
Okay, so why did you selected these great conversations? This isn't really a conversation, doesn't sound to me.
Well, it is and it isn't. It's really a set of presentations. Larry, Clay, Biff, Judy,
Okay.
They all give their piece. But Socrates, this is the way all the Plato's dialogues work. All the lesser people get to give their views, and then Socrates comes in and ties them all together and takes it to a higher level. So it's a conversation in a certain sense, but it's artificial. It's probably a conversation that never actually occurred. Plato is designing it as a way of trying out a series of ideas that then Socrates will knit together into a marvelous synthesis.
Okay.
Okay, but that form became extraordinarily important. So we're out of time, right?
No, we're doing good.
So here's this one that I asked you to read. This is Samuel Johnson, and I remember I said he's maybe the greatest conversationalist ever, and John Wilkes. Now, Wilkes was a libertine, a rake, so a womanizer. He was a Republican. He was a believer in democracy. And he had written, and he was kind of an atheist. And so Dr. Johnson, who was a Tory and a monarchist and a believer in traditional aristocratic societies and a profound Christian, loathed Wilkes. And Wilkes loathed Johnson, and they had written nasty pamphlets about each other, and it would be like, I'm trying to think of an analogy in our time, but it would be like maybe Newt Gingrich on the one hand and a radical feminist on the other hand, or Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch or something, but people who just have made a career out of openly, publicly hating each other.
Okay.
And so this is 1776. This is just the same time we're declaring independence. And here's Johnson. He was, as I said, the father of the English dictionary. This is a bust of him. He was a massive man, and he had some childhood diseases which gave him tics, and he was a very odd man. He sort of almost had a kind of a Tourette's syndrome about him, and he was not a easy man to know, but brilliant. Here's Johnson and Boswell, his biographer. They went on a famous trip to Scotland and the Hebrides, and Boswell is on the right, and Johnson with his staff is on the left. Here's Boswell, the greatest biographer ever, and one of the greatest diarists ever. His diary was found in the 20th century. It's one of the most unbelievably interesting documents you could ever see, 13 volumes. Here's Johnson in conversation. Johnson is famous for many pronouncements. I'm sure you've heard of some of them. He said, a second marriage is the triumph of hope over experience. He said, and the women in the room, I mean no, I don't endorse what he's saying. He said, a woman's preaching is like a dog walking on its hind legs. It is not done well, but you are surprised to see it done at all. And he was constantly being sent people's manuscripts to read. He hated to do it. And so he once got a manuscript from a guy, and he wrote back and said, "Dear sir, what you have written is both interesting and new. Unfortunately, what is new is not interesting, and what is interesting is not new." So he was famous for this sort of pronouncement. And he would hold forth at these dinner parties. He was not a great conversationalist in the sense of generous listening, because he was going to hold forth. And here's his dictionary. It's still one of the supreme monuments of Western civilization. Here he is he formed a literary club, and they would meet once a month at a tavern. And Johnson once said, "A tavern chair is the throne of human felicity." And here's what Boswell says of him. He was gloomy about death, and he was a very dark moralist. This is the most famous passage in the life of Johnson. "His mind resembled a vast amphitheater, the Colosseum at Rome. In the center stood his judgment, which like a mighty gladiator combated those apprehensions that, like the wild beasts of the arena, were all around him in cells ready to be let out upon him. After a conflict, he drives them back into their dens, but not killing them. They were still assailing him." So you get a picture of this extraordinary man. I won't do this one, we're out of time. But here's Wilkes in a caricature of the libertine, not holding himself like a gentleman at all. And so this is what happened. This is May of 1776. I'm quoting Boswell now. Boswell says, "My desire of being acquainted with celebrated men of every description had made me much about the same time obtain an introduction to Dr. Johnson and to John Wilkes. Two men more different could perhaps not be selected out of all mankind. They had even attacked one another with some asperity in their writings. I conceived an irresistible wish, if possible, to bring Dr. Johnson and Wilkes together. How to manage it was a nice and difficult matter." So he's got this plan. He's going to get these two gladiators who hate each other. Johnson didn't like this. Here's what he said of this at another occasion. "Don't you know that it is very uncivil to pit two people against one another?" So Boswell, of course, decides to do it. The dinner was at Edward Dilly's in London. He was a bookseller, and this occurred on May 15, 1776. And when I was thinking about this, Larry, Jefferson at this time is making his way from Monticello to the Second Continental Congress. So while this dinner party is going on, Jefferson is within 2 weeks of writing the most famous document of American history. So Boswell tricked Johnson into going. We don't have time maybe to go into it, but he set Johnson up. He said to Johnson, "Mr. Dilly is holding a dinner party in 2 weeks, and he'd like you to come." And Johnson said, "Oh, I should like to come. I like this Dilly." And then Boswell said, "But what if there was someone there that you really hate, and it would be offensive to you to do it?" And Johnson said, "How dare you talk that way? I'm a good man. There's nobody that I wouldn't want to. If Mr. Dilly has invited them, I, of course, would treat that with respect." And so Boswell now has him, because Johnson has declared that he's not, doesn't tell him it's Wilkes. So then Dilly wasn't too happy about it. Boswell tricks Johnson into coming. On the day that this dinner party is to take place, Boswell comes to Johnson's place, and Johnson, he says, "I found Johnson buffeting his books, covered with dust and making no preparation." So Johnson's decided he's not going. Boswell persuades him to go, and when Johnson finally decides to, he calls out to his servant, "Frank, a clean shirt," and off they go. So they get there, and Boswell says, "He found himself in the midst of a company he did not know. I kept myself snug and silent, watching how he would conduct himself." And Johnson would be meeting one person he didn't like after the next, and eventually Wilkes. And Boswell says Johnson would say, "Who is that man?" "Oh, that's John Wilkes." And he'd say, two, really worried, And he sat by himself in a corner for a long time because he didn't want to admit how upset he was that Boswell had tricked him into this minute. The guests were Dr. Johnson, John Wilkes, Arthur Lee, an American. Johnson hated Americans. John Miller, Dr. Lettsom, Dr. Slater, a druggist, and Edward Dilly. So that's the dinner party. Dinner is served. Now watch this. This is so great. Wilkes placed himself next to Dr. Johnson and behaved to him with so much attention and politeness that he gained upon him insensibly. Boswell says, "No man ate more heartily than Johnson, or loved better what was nice and delicate. Mr. Wilkes was very assiduous in helping him to some fine veal. 'Pray give me leave, sir, a little of stuffing, some gravy, sir. Let me have the pleasure of giving you some butter. Allow me to recommend a squeeze of this orange.'" So here are these two terrible enemies who just don't want to be in the same zip code, and they both are now being civil, but Wilkes begins, and he is being solicitous of a man that he loathes. And Johnson then says, "Sir, sir, I'm obliged to you, sir," cried Johnson, bowing and turning his head to him with a look for some time of surly virtue, but in a short while of complacency. They talked about, the conversation goes on for 10 or 15 pages in the biography. They talked about the poetry of Horace, the Roman writer, contemporary writers of London, David Garrick, who was Johnson's protege and the most famous actor of the age, Scotland's poverty and treelessness. Boswell is from Scotland, so it's always easy to make fun of Scotland in Boswell's presence. But here's what's so interesting. These two gladiatorial antagonists were gracious to each other through this whole dinner, and when they eventually figured out that they could get rid of all of their accumulated unhappiness by attacking Boswell. So Johnson says, "You know, sir, I lately took my friend Boswell and showed him genuine civilized life in an English provincial town. I turned him loose at Lichfield, my native city, that he might see for once real civility. For you know, he lives among savages in Scotland and among rakes in London." So Johnson attacks his protege. And look what Wilkes says. "Except when he is with grave, sober, decent people like you and me." And Johnson says, "And we ashamed of him." And then they go on and they assault Scotland over and over, and they spend the evening attacking Boswell, but Boswell's loving it because A, he got them together, B, they got along, and he doesn't mind being the butt of the joke as long as the dinner comes off. Yeah. It is one of the great moments in English literature, and if you have time, go home and just Google Johnson and Wilkes dinner party, May 16th, 1776. It's a long and fascinating account, and it's one of several hundred, maybe several thousand conversations in the life of Johnson that are recorded by Boswell.
So what makes this a great conversation in your mind?
Well, for one thing, here's what Boswell says of it. This record, right after dinner, he goes home and writes it up. "This record, though by no means so perfect as I could wish, will serve to give a notion of a very curious interview." There's one element, the unusual nature of it, which was not only pleasing at the time, but had the agreeable and benignant effect of reconciling any animosity and sweetening any acidity, which in the various bustle of political contest had been produced in the minds of two men who, though widely different, had so many things in common: classical learning, modern literature, wit and humor, and ready repartee, that it would have been much to be regretted if they had been forever at a distance from each other. So this is partly a spectacle. You know, he's brought these men have more in common than they thought, and they agree, because they're exquisite gentlemen, to be civil to each other, even though they're going to attack each other politically after this. So that's part of it. It's the unusual nature of it. And then the conversation, you know, it's not just about veal and gravy. They start talking about ancient literature, and they're agreeing and disagreeing, and Johnson is saying, "I've never thought about it quite that way, Mr. Wilkes, and thank you for the, that's
Does this change their relationship afterwards?
No,
not a bit.
They go right back to it.
Okay.
But it's a cool moment. And then Edmund Burke, the famous Irish parliamentarian, said, he was a contemporary of all of them, "Mr. Burke gave me much credit for the successful negotiation and pleasantly said that there was nothing equal to it in the whole history of the corps diplomatique." You know, it's like bringing Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat together the way Carter did. Yeah. And when Carter brought Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat together at Camp David, there's a famous and extraordinary account of it in Carter's first memoir. And so they get together, and this is one of the most historic moments of the modern world. You know, Anwar Sadat would pay for his life for that moment. And so Carter said, "Well, Anwar, why don't you say a few things first?" And so Anwar Sadat stood up and gave an hour and a half vicious attack on Israel, the Zionist entity, and all the things that Israel had ever done wrong, and Israel's responsible for everything that's wrong in the Middle East, and blah, blah, blah. It was just unending assault on Israel. And so then he finishes, and Carter's thinking, not sure this is going to work. But he turned to Menachem Begin and he said, well, Menachem, if you can just agree to that, I think we got a treaty. And that broke the ice, and everyone laughed, and then they wound up signing one of the great peace treaties of the modern world. Yeah. So that's part of what's going on here, too. Okay. We're out of time, but here are Wilkes and Johnson. Johnson on the left, Wilkes on the right, both wearing wigs. Here's Wilkes himself. Let's just glance at this one.
Yeah.
Because I think the people in the audience have thoughts, and I'd rather do that. Yeah. But here's Hamilton on the left, Jefferson on the right. He was actually looking this way in the painting, and I thought it would be better if they looked at each other in conversation. But Jefferson had been the minister to France. He came back in November of 1789. The government was in New York. Jefferson came late. Hamilton had already established himself as the Secretary of the Treasury and effectively the Prime Minister. And Jefferson realized over time that Hamilton was a genius, but somebody whose vision of America was fundamentally at odds with Jefferson's. And so at this time, there were two big issues. One was, where will the national capital of the United States eventually be? And the other one was, should Hamilton's national debt and his funding schemes be approved? And the South didn't want to approve Hamilton's funding schemes because, for one thing, Virginia had already paid off its debt from the war, and now if the nation assumed all of the debt, Virginia would be paying twice. But also, the Southerners felt that if Hamilton got his way, it would consolidate the national government and swallow up the states, and they were still states' rightists. So they, on the first instance in Congress, the South held up the assumption bill and it failed. And meanwhile, the capital is in New York. It's probably going to wind up in Philadelphia eventually. So Jefferson says, as you know, that he was walking in front of Washington's house one day, and here's Colonel Hamilton, and his hair is disheveled and his stockings are down around his ankles, and he looks like he hasn't slept for weeks. And Jefferson says to him, "My dear sir, tell me what's the matter." And Hamilton tells him, if we don't get our assumption and national debt bills passed, we may as well just give up and the country will collapse. And I'm thinking of resigning. All of my dreams of America are falling apart. And Jefferson says, well, I too believe in fiscal responsibility, but I'm a Southerner, and I understand why Virginia is upset about this. What if I held a dinner party? What if I created a dinner party and I brought Madison and you together and I'll have an exquisite French meal with great French wines, and I'll just stand by and the two of you can talk like gentlemen and see if something can be worked out. And it happened in June of 1790, and what came out of it, as you know, is two things. Hamilton got all of the fiscal things he wanted, but the capital of the United States was permanently located on the Potomac in the Upper South, which is what the Southerners wanted. And so this is regarded as maybe the most famous dinner party in American history. Jefferson later said he was duped. Here's Madison. Look how sweet he is. Just a kid. There's another dinner party we probably won't talk about where John Adams was also present, and Jefferson and Hamilton. Here's Madison from the statue in the Library of Congress building, a wonderful statue. But here's the District of Columbia. So what was eventually decided was the capital wouldn't stay in New York. It would go for 10 years to Philadelphia while a property was carved out of the wilderness on the Potomac, and Maryland would cede part of the territory and Virginia would cede the rest of the territory, and a 10-mile square would be built, and it would be a federal installation, neither Virginian nor Marylandian, and it would be called the District of Columbia, and there the government of the United States would be built. And so Jefferson and his pals got what they wanted, compromising with Hamilton and his pals who got what they wanted. And then look at this. George Washington got what he wanted. The capital of the United States was built in the Upper South and just a few miles from his home at Mount Vernon. He had always dreamed of the capital being near Mount Vernon, and he got it. So and you tell your story from being on the radio the other day. So this is one of the great moments of compromise, of people fundamentally at odds with each other coming to terms.
Well, what Clay's talking about, I was on the radio and I was talking about this conversation. Did anybody hear that, by the way? Did anybody hear that? Some of you did, okay. And so I'm talking about the great conversation, and there's an art to great conversation, but there's also an art to compromise. And this is a perfect example, because really what this did is it put the United States on the track, that the Hamiltonian track of being an industrial nation, and people had to look to the federal government, because what happened is the federal government assumed all the debt that came out of the Revolutionary War.
Both national and state.
Yeah, the state debt as well. So now instead of looking at states, people were looking at the national government to have to have the debts realized. But so at any rate, so I explained this and said there's compromise.
On the radio.
On the radio, and some guy calls in and says, I don't buy that compromise thing. And you don't? And he says, no. He says, look at what the Democrats have done. All they do is spend, spend, spend. And we've got all this debt because of the Democrats, so why should you compromise with them? And I'm thinking, what's that got to do with any of this? You know, but
leaving aside the politics of it, he was saying, I'm not buying this idea that compromise is an important element in political life.
You can't compromise, and you know, which I disagreed with, but
then the calls just got worse, right?
It got a little worse. But
yeah. Welcome to Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
So I think we're done here.
I think we're done. You know, we've got about 20 minutes here, maybe tops, if people are interested and have some questions for Clay.
Robin has the microphone.
We've got a microphone. We do. This one. We do ask that you wait for the microphone, please, because this is being streamed and being recorded, and so we need to.
She'll figure it out.
There we go.
So
are there any questions about conversation?
Or disagreements?
Does anybody want to, just to express their view of what a great conversation is that may or may not fit with what we're talking about here?
Right here?
Sure.
Well, my comment is not so much what is a great conversation, but to share with you or challenge both of you how this was a great conversation you just had, coming to an interesting point. My challenge is if you had tried this if both of you were fluent in a different language. I had that experience when I was in the Peace Corps in Latin America and Peru after I'd been there about 2 years. There were a group of 5 of us or so in the office, and these were in the days like when you didn't have any telephones or radios or communication of any kind. You had to go physically talk to each other. And we had 5 of us were sitting around doing a philosophical discussion of how the country was changing from what it had been because of the influence of the modern world. And we did it in English, and then we said, I wonder what would happen since we all spoke Spanish. We all did the same thing in Spanish, and you know what? We ended up at a different place.
No.
Interesting what happens with the semantics of language to a conversation like you just had, which I think was wonderful today.
Well, you've had that experience. You lived in Italy for a time, and
What I find out is if we spoke a different language, we would just holler at each other. What I'm saying is, for some reason, it's almost like if you holler, they're going to understand it better. It's a terrible way to
I've had this. I was in Yugoslavia once, and my friend Douglas and I were there, and our hosts were people who didn't speak English, and they had like a 6-year-old son who spoke a little English, and he was our translator, and we all got idiotically drunk. And then the older man, this was when Marshal Tito was the dictator of Cuba, started in on America. We couldn't understand anything except we knew he wasn't happy with America. And so then we started, as you always do when you're abroad, we started to try to defend America. We can't talk to this man. And so we're drawing GDP charts and the tripartites, it's just a mess. But when you break through across barriers like that, it's really something. Yeah, I agree with that. Right. Right. You're thinking in a language that's not your own.
Right.
Well, at that point it was our own, because we've been there for 2 years.
Okay.
Okay.
And I thought in it at that point.
That's a great thing.
It changes how things happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question.
Right. There's a question over here, or comment.
We're eager to hear from you, so please raise your hand and we'll get to you.
Right here.
Oh, she's got 2.
Oh.
This was very, excuse me, very interesting. I have a question relating to an early aspect of your conversation. Excuse me. When you spoke about Teddy Roosevelt making the comment that he did, I could not have been president of the United States had I not spent time in North Dakota. To your knowledge, was there ever any question, did anyone ever pose the question to him, define what you mean by that?
That's a great question.
It could be one of two or three things, and I do wonder, what did he mean?
Well, when I moved back to North Dakota almost 8 years ago now, that's the question I wanted to answer. That, you hear that quoted constantly. I would never have been president if not for my time in North Dakota. And I'll admit that I was a little cynical about it and thought, he probably said that in South Dakota and Montana and Utah and Cuba, but it's not true. He meant it. This was his second home, but he never wrote about it in a direct response. He never answered the question you want answered. But I've been trying to puzzle it out, and I think what he meant was something like this, and I'll be really brief about it, but that he was never going to understand the size and the greatness of this country and the heartland if he didn't go out onto the frontier of the country and relax into that world and become an authentic Westerner. And it could have been Wyoming, and it could have been South Dakota. It happened to be North Dakota because the Northern Pacific Railroad could get him here. So he comes out for this very limited purpose of killing a buffalo, and he falls in love with the Badlands, and he decides to be a cowboy and a rancher, and he really threw himself into it. He humbled himself in ways that you might not have expected. And so he said in Dickinson, in his first great national speech on the 4th of July, 1886, "I feel now that I am truly one of yourselves." And he meant it. So he had learned something about the heart of the country and unprivileged human beings, and he was a person of great privilege. Most of us are unprivileged. We're just Americans, and he learned something about that, and it toughened him up physically, and it toughened him up mentally, and it made him a small d Democrat, that he loved all sorts of people that weren't from his social set or as highly educated or as privileged as he was. And so I think those things are part of the answer to this question. And he writes about it constantly. He wrote 4 books about his Dakota experience, but he never says what exactly he meant on that occasion, but I think that's more or less what he was getting at. But it's a great thing to have said. And when I travel, I always quote it wherever I am in America, and I say, and all of us North Dakotans are required to memorize that at birth. Because it's he's our only president, Virginia has 8, Ohio has 7, this is ours.
We got Theo. The speech you just mentioned at Dickinson, if you have not, here's a nice day trip for you. If you haven't been to Dickinson, to the Stark County Courthouse, I recommend you do that through the TR Center in Dickinson State. Clay had worked with them, and they've got a statue of Teddy Roosevelt as a very young man. 24 years old, standing on a soapbox, literally on a soapbox, giving that speech. Ready to give that speech. It's a great statue.
Was done by a man named Tom Bullinger, who's a DSU graduate who lives in Tempe, Arizona, and we wanted him to do a statue of Roosevelt just about to be introduced. And so I got to work with him for about 2 years, and I said, we want him to be kind of about to be introduced, and he's nervous, he's young, it's his first great national speech. And so then he made it. It's just beautiful. And I went down there when they were just finishing it, and it was such a great moment. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, it's fine, but if you could maybe hollow out the cheekbone a little." And he went up on the ladder and hollowed it out, and so I'm suddenly feeling powerful, And so I said, "Would you mind if I did something?" And he said, "Well, yes, actually, I would." But he said, "You can go on the back of the boot and make any mark you want." So I went back there and just made a little mark, and so that's it.
And it is there in the statue.
A little scratch mark, yeah, but it is a beautiful statue of Roosevelt. We think of him as the big, stout Roosevelt. He wasn't when he was here. He was just a kid, and his health wasn't great. And one of the local people said you could put your hands around his waist. He was so thin. And so we tried to show him at that kind of tentative moment.
Yeah. Before we go to another question, back to Char's point about language, I was just thinking about this. You know, a conversation in a different language is obviously, it's going to get you to a different point, but as well, our ability to express things in different languages. I was reading about this Plato's Symposium, where the Greeks had many, many terms for love. Mm-hmm. Each different kind, we would put an adjective in front of it: physical love, intellectual love, emotional love. But they had different words for love.
Different branches of love.
Yeah, so
it's in the New Testament too.
So they could talk about love in a very different way and have a completely different word for it. And so they say the Greeks invented philosophy because they had a language that could actually express these concepts. And so to have a conversation about love with a Greek would be a very different conversation than it would be with us in English, because we have a very limited
We have one word
ability.
that has to do a lot of heavy lifting.
Right.
And then in the New Testament, there's that famous scene where Jesus is talking to Peter, and he says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, I love you." And then Jesus says, "No, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, I love you." And then it goes 3 times. Well, what's happening there is just what you say. The first one, Peter says, "Yes, I love you romantically. I love you passionately," let's put it that way. And Jesus rejects that. And the second time, Peter says, "I love you, I philo you. I love you in the sense of I love my friend." And Jesus rejects that. And on the third time, Peter finally gets it right and says, "Oh, Lord, I agape you." And agape is the highest form of Christian love, when you love without possession, you love without expectation, you love as an act of purity. And so we read it in English and we think, what's going on here? But in Greek, it's a very meaningful cascade from passionate love to brotherly love to agape love, which is what Jesus is trying to get him to say.
And when we translate it, it's just love,
Love. Yeah, because we don't have we don't have that capacity.
That capacity, yeah. Okay.
Here we are, sir.
Thank you. I don't know if I've ever been involved with anyone in a great conversation. I've had a lot of fun conversations, mostly on a phone.
Really?
It seems like it's easier to talk with folks about different things on a telephone, and we have conversation. Whereas if we stand face to face, really don't talk much.
Maybe that's what Garrison Keillor's talking about. There's a certain cover that you have because you're not within the physical space of somebody, where it's often very hard to have certain types of conversation when you're really looking directly at a person. But if on the phone, that gives you that little detachment maybe that frees you up to say things you might have a harder time saying. I don't know.
That's an excellent point.
Fewer distractions. A couple more back there.
Someone
David
back.
has a thought. Man in the back.
Do you think it's something new, or has it just been with us forever? But it seems to me, going back to the talk TV and talk radio, we're shouting at each other more than conversing. But it seems to me that we could be talking about things from abortion, which you rarely change anybody's viewpoint, but abortion to Social Security to a sports nickname. And every one of those issues, the very future of the republic is at stake. That seems to be the problem, that we can't really have a conversation about it because, well, this is so important, and if you don't agree with me, you don't believe in America. You don't believe in the future.
Yeah.
Isn't that more of a problem than it used to be, or has it always been there?
I do think that I think it comes in waves, because in Jefferson's time, of course, the whole future of the country was at stake. And Jefferson was so appalled by Hamilton and vice versa, because they each felt the other one was betraying the revolution and the dream of America. But then we gelled after the Civil War. There was this, we sort of became who we are. We've had our moments during the Civil Rights Movement. There have been moments, but Vietnam. But now it seems like we've moved into kind of hyperdrive on that notion that I can't grant you anything because A, you're wrong, and B, we're struggling for the very success, maybe survival, of freedom on earth. And I think we need to take it down a notch. What I love is the Enlightenment's idea. Voltaire said, "Madam, I disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it." That's the spirit, is that you know, there's less is usually at stake than we think. And maybe we can get along much more than we do. And I think that Barack Obama has been an incredibly polarizing figure for good reasons and not good reasons. But I think that this is one of the most but it was that way with Clinton too. I mean, it was that way with George W. Bush. I mean, we've lived in a very polarizing era.
Yeah. But Arthur Schlesinger Jr. says that we study history, and it's a great antidote against thinking that we live in the worst of times, that there are other times that have been bad. And so when I think about, you know, okay, so President Obama has been polarizing. Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and 11 states seceded from the Union. I mean, that's polarizing. Yeah, you know, and so I think about the 1840s, and I mentioned this on the radio for those of you that heard it, but we had actually in Congress a gag rule. And if you presented a petition to the United States Congress as a citizen of the United States, and you presented a petition and it had anything to do with slavery, it was immediately tabled. It could not be discussed on the floor. And of course, as you know, Clay, that's the time when we see a caning of Senator Sumner.
Beaten almost to death.
Yeah, Preston Brooks from South Carolina comes in with his cane because he had said something that he interpreted as being insulting to a relative of his that was a slave owner. So we've had polarizing conversation, I guess. We've shouted at each other in the past. Let me put it that way. We've shouted at each other in the past. The question is, how do we get from where we are now to more civil conversation about really important topics? And at David's point, now every conversation or every shouting match is about something that is going to save the Union or save the Republic. But that's not true. We need to put those things in their proper perspective.
Well, my mother's motto is, things once said can never be taken back. My mother-in-law's motto was, in a conflict, you can either ratchet things up or ratchet things down. And that it's in your interest to ratchet them down. And I think now, because of talk radio and talk television and the blogosphere, and now everyone's publishing because everyone's on the social networks, I think we're talking things up rather than talking them down. I hope I'm not just sounding like an old guy, but when I was growing up, John Chancellor, Eric Severide, Walter Cronkite, they were people who talked things down. They had a calming effect on our national discourse. And they would not have had these lunatics from the left or right on their shows. They would have just said, that's not what we do here. And on a few occasions, Eric Severide said things that upset Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite then carefully, but on the air, restored the balance and said, Eric, I think you might have taken that a little too far this time. And Severide didn't like that. But that era had figures, our major media figures were people who were civil, calming, non-sensationalist, and there was a disincentive for sensationalism. It was going on, but people didn't have access. Now, really, I would point to the rise of Rush Limbaugh as the moment when this dam broke, and now there is an enormous amount of talk radio and talk television. That's maybe good, but it has created, but I don't see many calming figures in our national discourse. I think people like Bill Maher, I find him pretty funny at times, or Rachel Maddow or Lawrence O'Donnell are demonizing the opposition in a way that is it's clear to me that that's not fair. And so I would hope that these people of such great responsibility would realize that demonizing may be good for ratings, but it is not good for America.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think there was
One back
two more questions, and then it's going to be quitting time here.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your comments. It's particularly interesting for me, somebody who taught speech communication and coached competitive speech for 40 years. And so it's really interesting to hear the things that come out and that you share with us about conversations. And I have two comments. One is about people that we've been talking about, the lack of civility among these people who gain national attention through a very pointed tongue. people like Rush, who I call verbal terrorists. And I have no respect for them whatsoever. But you know, that started many years ago with a guy by the name, I believe his first name was Jack Payne, I'm not sure, but I think that's who it was. And he had a vicious tongue, but died quite young from cancer. And so that thorn was kind of removed from our side. But it is a scary world when we live in, when people who do the things they do to our language and say the things they say about public officials and elected leaders and think that it's all right to do that. They should live in some place where they don't have that right to be able to do that. Enough of my comments about these verbal terrorists, but that's what I call them. The other side of the coin is something that I always taught and dealt with as part of this conversation, and that is the idea between listening and hearing. And you know, they always say that the best speakers are the people who are the best listeners. And of course, the very simple line being that you can hear something which is passive, but when you hear or listen to something, it becomes active in a sense because you're responding to it. And it seems to me that same kind of thing needs to be just pointed out in a sense that people can talk and it is not a conversation. They are talking, they are verbalizing, they are putting their thoughts out there. But it really is a sense is, to me, all right, a very passive kind of thing. Whereas someone who is conversing with you is actively sharing thoughts and prompting you to respond accordingly. Thank you for your conversation. I did enjoy what you had to say.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say one thing to that. I think we do have verbal terrorism, but I think the left gives as good as it gets. I mean, it's not just the right. The right has really taken advantage of the liberation of talk radio and talk television and has been more commercially successful than the left. But I hear things from the left that just embarrass me as an American in the demonization of people who hold views other than their own. It seems to me that nobody should be spared criticism who does that both sides do it.
Yeah, I agree. We've got one last question here, or comment.
I'd be interested in your comments on the distinction between dialogue and conversation.
Larry, that's for you. Distinction between dialogue and conversation.
Why is that for me?
I just thought it would be a nice thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think that you can have dialogue, and that's an exchange of information. I don't know if that's a conversation. I don't know. It seems to me a conversation takes things to a higher level than a dialogue does. A dialogue is exchanging words. Hopefully you're hearing and listening, to use that term, that you're listening to each other. But I think a conversation has an actual purpose for it, is a higher elevation than a dialogue. What do you think?
Well, as a practical matter, we have few dialogues, but we have thousands and thousands of conversations. I mean, a dialogue has, in my opinion, it has a more formal aspect to it, whereas conversation is just what happens. Dialogue would be, say a dialogue between the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That's a dialogue. They're not talking about stuff. They're talking about slavery in the American West. It seems to me that dialogue is reserved for a more formalized exchange. It's somewhere between conversation and debate.
Yeah, dialogue is more counterpoint than a conversation. Would you agree with that or not?
We just make this stuff
Yeah,
up.
we making it up. Yeah.
Well, that's
Well, it grows late here. Before we close out, I want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, my good friend Clay Jenkinson. We are doing this. This is our 5th year. This was his idea that we have these conversations.
I'm
delighted. Underpaid.
underpaid,
We'll have that conversation later.
Yeah, that'll be a dialogue, honey.
But I appreciate those of you that have come to these things, and we're looking forward to another season of these next year when we start.
We're going to do
up the
6
school
more.
year. We'll do 6 more
If
next
you have
year.
thoughts about the topics,
Yeah, please write it down. Let us know.
because
we're
kind
down
of
on this.
We
Let us know.
this is our 5th year. In year 2, we ran out of knowledge, and we've been on fumes ever since. And so, if you gave us the topics, then we go out and research them.
Yeah. So thank you, Clay. Thank you all for being
Thanks.
here. Appreciate it.